On the afternoon of July 15, 2005, a summer vacation that should have become one of the happiest memories of the Sullivan family turned into a mystery that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In less than 10 minutes, 3 little boys disappeared from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, while their parents were dealing with a sudden burst of wind that scattered their beach things. There was no warning, no clear witness, no obvious trace left behind. One moment, Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan were part of the noise and rhythm of an ordinary American beach day. The next, they were gone. The Sullivan family had come from Charlotte, North Carolina, hoping for a simple break from their normal life. Andrew Sullivan was 35, a responsible and hardworking construction project manager who spent most of the year balancing deadlines, budgets, job sites, and family bills. He was the kind of father who believed stability was built day by day, not through big promises, but through work, patience, and showing up. His wife, Rachel Sullivan, 32, had devoted the past 3 years to raising their triplet sons. Since the boys were born in 2002, her days had been shaped by routines, meals, laundry, appointments, noise, and the constant demands of 3 children growing at the same time. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were not identical triplets, but to strangers they looked almost impossible to tell apart. They had the same bright young faces, the same soft features of early childhood, and the same kind of smile that made people stop and comment whenever the family went out together. Even Andrew and Rachel sometimes needed a second look when the boys were moving quickly around the house or laughing at the same time. But their personalities were different enough for their parents to know them deeply. Noah, the oldest, was energetic and mischievous, always the first to turn an ordinary moment into a game. Mason, the middle child, was quieter, more observant, and often seemed to notice things before the others did. Caleb, the youngest, followed his brothers with complete trust, carrying the kind of cheerful innocence that made him the emotional center of the 3. By the summer of 2005, Andrew and Rachel felt they had earned a short vacation. Life in Charlotte was stable but never easy. 3 toddlers meant every day required planning, energy, and patience. Myrtle Beach was not a luxury escape for them. It was a practical family trip, the kind many American families take when they want the ocean, affordable food, a motel room, and a few days where ordinary pressure feels farther away. They arrived with beach towels, children's clothes, snacks, sunscreen, plastic buckets, and the quiet hope that the boys would remember their first real visit to the Atlantic Ocean. The morning of July 15th began with the kind of happiness Andrew and Rachel had wanted. The boys were excited by the water, fascinated by the sound and movement of the beach, and completely absorbed in the freedom of a summer day. Andrew and Rachel stayed close, careful in the way parents of 3 small children must always be careful. The boys played in the shallow area near the edge of the water, where other families were gathered and where the beach felt safe enough for a short family afternoon. Nothing about the day suggested danger. It was not late. It was not isolated. It was not a hidden place. It was a public beach filled with families, vacationers, lifeguards, and the ordinary movement of summer tourism. Around lunchtime, the family took a break from the beach and ate at a casual seafood place nearby. It was the kind of restaurant common along the South Carolina coast, with children's menus, baskets of fried seafood, sweet tea, and tired parents trying to make one meal work for everyone. For Andrew and Rachel, even that simple lunch felt like a success. The boys were curious about everything, especially the unfamiliar food and the idea that the ocean was connected to what people ate. Caleb, in particular, seemed fascinated by the seafood on the table, while Noah and Mason turned the meal into another small adventure. To anyone watching, they looked like a normal young family in the middle of a normal American summer vacation. After lunch, the Sullivans returned to the beach for the afternoon. By around 2 o'clock, the boys were again near the shallow water, close enough for Andrew and Rachel to keep watch from their spot on the sand. The parents were only about 30 feet away. There was no reason in that moment to believe the distance was dangerous. Other families were nearby. The beach was open. The boys were together. The day still belonged to the ordinary world. Then the wind changed. A sudden strong gust rushed through the area, throwing the family's carefully arranged beach setup into confusion. Towels shifted, lightweight items scattered, and the umbrella became difficult to manage. Andrew and Rachel focused on keeping their belongings from blowing across the sand and into the space of other beachgoers. It was the kind of small disruption every parent recognizes, inconvenient but not frightening. It lasted only minutes. Less than 10 minutes passed before their attention returned fully to the place where the boys had been playing. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were no longer there. At first, the possibility seemed too impossible to accept. Andrew and Rachel believed the boys must have moved a few yards away, perhaps toward another group of children, perhaps behind a family setting up nearby, perhaps just outside the line of sight. But each second made that explanation weaker. Their beach toys were still there. Their things had not been taken. No one nearby could clearly say where they had gone. The shallow water showed no sign of struggle or accident. The boys had not simply wandered back to the towels. They had not been found with another family. They had not reached the snack stands, the parking lot, or the public restrooms. The ordinary sounds of Myrtle Beach continued around them, but for Andrew and Rachel, time narrowed into one terrifying fact. All three of their sons had vanished at the same time. At 3:10 p.m., Andrew called 911. Within minutes, what had begun as a family vacation became an emergency. The names Noah Sullivan, Mason Sullivan, and Caleb Sullivan were given to police as missing children. Their ages, their clothing, their appearance, and the detail that they were triplets were repeated again and again. Rachel and Andrew entered a nightmare no parent is ever prepared for. One made worse by the lack of any clear answer. 3 boys had disappeared in broad daylight from a busy American beach. There was no confirmed witness to the moment they vanished. There was no immediate evidence of where they had gone. And on that July afternoon in 2005, the Sullivan family's life split into 2 parts. Everything before those 10 minutes and everything after. The first hours after Andrew's 911 call were filled with urgency, confusion, and a growing fear that no one on the beach knew how to name. Myrtle Beach police arrived quickly, followed by beach patrol and emergency responders. Because 3 children had disappeared at the same time, the case was treated as critical from the beginning. The detail that made the situation even more alarming was their age. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were only 3 years old. They could not travel far on their own. They could not explain themselves clearly to strangers. They could not disappear from a busy public beach without something forcing the world around them to look away at exactly the wrong moment. The first assumption was that the boys might have entered the water and been pulled out farther than anyone realized. Searchers began with the ocean because that was the most immediate danger on any beach. Lifeguards and rescue teams checked the shallow areas first, then expanded the search beyond the part of the water where the boys had been playing. The Coast Guard was notified, and the search widened along the shoreline. But almost immediately, that theory felt wrong to the people who knew the area. The boys had been playing in very shallow water. The weather had changed only briefly because of the gust of wind, but there had been no dangerous surf, no strong current reported in that exact area, and no witness who saw 3 small children being swept away. The second possibility was that the boys had wandered off together. Officers began checking the surrounding area. Nearby restrooms, snack stands, parking lots, hotel entrances, boardwalk access points, arcades, small shops, and family restaurants along the tourist strip. Myrtle Beach in mid-July was crowded with vacationers, and that made the search both hopeful and difficult. A crowded place meant someone might have seen something. It also meant that 3 small boys could be hidden by ordinary movement for a few crucial minutes. Descriptions of the triplets were repeated to everyone nearby. 3 boys, age 3, similar appearance, last seen near the shallow water. Their names were Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan. They were visiting from Charlotte, North Carolina. They were last seen while their parents were dealing with beach items scattered by a sudden wind gust. The fact that they looked so much alike became the one detail people remembered. Several tourists confirmed seeing 3 little boys playing together earlier that afternoon. Some remembered how unusual and sweet it was to see 3 children who looked so similar. Others remembered a young family trying to manage 3 toddlers during a summer beach day. But none of them could say what happened during the exact minutes that mattered. That absence of a witness became the center of the mystery. By late afternoon, police had moved from a missing child response into a much broader investigation. Officers questioned vendors, hotel employees, restaurant workers, lifeguards, families seated near the Sullivan family, and anyone who had been near that part of the beach between 2:45 and 3:10 p.m. They asked whether anyone had seen a stranger speaking to the boys, a vehicle leaving quickly, a person carrying a child, or 3 children being guided away. The answers were vague, incomplete, and often useless. People remembered the triplets before they disappeared. No one remembered the disappearance itself. The lack of cameras made the situation worse. In 2005, Myrtle Beach had security cameras in some businesses and hotels, but not the kind of full public surveillance that would become more common years later. Many cameras were pointed at entrances, cash registers, parking areas, or hotel lobbies. Few captured the beach clearly. Even when investigators collected available footage, the quality was poor, the angles were limited, and the timing did not provide a clear path from the Sullivan family's beach spot to any identifiable location. There was no clean image of the boys leaving. There was no obvious suspect. As evening approached, the case spread through local news. A family vacation had become a public emergency. Reporters began broadcasting the names and faces of the missing triplets. Police asked anyone who had been at Myrtle Beach that afternoon to come forward, especially tourists who had taken photographs or home videos. In 2005, many families still carried digital cameras or camcorders on vacation, and investigators hoped that some background image might contain a clue. Even a blurry frame of the boys, a stranger nearby, or a vehicle in the wrong place could matter. That night, the search did not stop. Emergency teams continued working through the coastal area. Alerts went out to nearby counties and law enforcement agencies across South Carolina and North Carolina. Hospitals were notified in case unidentified children were brought in. Bus stations, taxi services, rental car agencies, and highway patrol units were contacted. Every hour that passed made the case more frightening, because 3 toddlers could not survive long without help, and if someone had taken them, the distance between the boys and the beach was growing. On July 16th, the search expanded dramatically. Volunteers arrived after seeing the news. Churches, local families, hotel staff, and vacationers joined organized search efforts. Flyers appeared with the boys' faces and names. National child safety organizations were contacted. Police kept all possibilities open, but each one had problems. If the boys had drowned, there should have been some sign. If they had wandered away, someone should have found them. If they had been abducted, someone should have noticed 3 children being taken from a public beach in daylight. But nothing fit. For Andrew and Rachel, the second day was worse than the first because shock began to give way to helpless waiting. They had entered the beach as parents managing a difficult but happy day with 3 small children. Now they were parents repeating descriptions of their sons to strangers, answering the same questions again and again, and watching professional search places where no child appeared. They were not allowed the comfort of one clear explanation. Every possibility was terrifying, and every hour without news made each possibility harder to bear. By the 3rd day, the search had covered the beach, nearby streets, businesses, parking areas, and sections of coastline beyond the original site. Tips came in, but none led to Noah, Mason, or Caleb. Some callers thought they had seen 3 boys in a van. Others remembered a man acting strangely. Some reported children who looked similar in another city. Investigators followed what they could, but the case remained empty at its core. There were 3 missing boys, a 10-minute gap, and a beach full of people who had seen them alive but had not seen them vanish. Within a week, the story reached beyond Myrtle Beach. Regional stations covered it. Newspapers printed the family's photographs. The case was discussed in communities throughout the Carolinas. Parents across the country understood the fear immediately because the setting was so ordinary. It did not happen in a hidden alley or an abandoned building. It happened during a family vacation, in the middle of the day, in a place where thousands of parents had trusted the world to be safe enough for a few minutes. But public attention did what public attention often does. It rose quickly, then began to weaken when no new answers arrived. Other crimes appeared in the news. Other emergencies took space. The Sullivan triplets remained missing, but the country's focus moved on. Andrew and Rachel could not move on. For them, the investigation did not become an old story. It became the structure of their lives. Andrew stepped away from work so he could follow leads, meet investigators, speak with anyone who claimed to know something, and travel whenever a possible sighting emerged. Rachel contacted missing children organizations, hospitals, shelters, churches, foster care offices, and law enforcement agencies across state lines. She learned how quickly hope could become pain, but she also learned that stopping felt impossible. By the end of the first year, the official search had slowed. Resources were limited. New evidence had not appeared. Investigators still kept the case open, but the active daily urgency faded. To the outside world, the disappearance of Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan was becoming a cold case. To their parents, it remained the same afternoon. July 15, 2005. Myrtle Beach. A sudden gust of wind. Less than 10 minutes. And 3 little boys who had not come back. By 2006, the disappearance of Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan had entered a different and crueler stage. The first desperate weeks had been filled with police cars, search teams, phone calls, interviews, news crews, flyers, and urgent promises that every lead would be checked. But after months without evidence, the investigation could no longer move with the same force. Myrtle Beach police still kept the case open. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children still listed the boys. Their photographs still appeared in missing child databases. Yet the daily machinery of the search began to slow. For Andrew and Rachel Sullivan, nothing slowed. Their sons were still 3 years old in their minds. Every morning began with the same impossible question. Where were they now? Every evening ended with the same unanswered fear. Had someone fed them, protected them, called them by their real names? The rest of the world spoke of the case as something that had happened. For Andrew and Rachel, it was still happening. It happened every time the phone rang. It happened every time a stranger in a grocery store glanced too long at one of the missing posters. It happened every July when summer returned and families packed cars for beach vacations as if the world could still be trusted. In 2006, police formally reduced the active investigation because no new solid evidence had emerged. The decision was practical, based on limited resources, dead-end tips, and the absence of physical proof. To the Sullivan family, it felt like another loss. The boys had already vanished from the beach. Now it felt as if they were slowly vanishing from official urgency as well. Andrew could not accept that. He took leave from work again and again, then eventually left his position altogether. Construction projects required presence, deadlines, and a clear head. He had none of those things anymore. He began traveling whenever a possible lead appeared. A call from South Carolina, a message from Georgia, a report from Tennessee, a child seen in a church shelter in Florida. He followed anything that sounded even remotely possible. Some leads came from well-meaning people who genuinely believed they had seen one of the boys. Others came from people who were confused, lonely, or chasing attention. Andrew learned to tell the difference, but he still checked as much as he could, because the cost of ignoring the right lead seemed unbearable. Rachel took a different path, but her life became just as consumed. She joined parent groups connected to missing children, learned how to work with nonprofit organizations, and began building relationships with mothers and fathers who knew the same kind of waiting. Through them, she learned the language of age-progressed images, case numbers, law enforcement contacts, child welfare offices, and media follow-ups. She sent packets of information to shelters, pediatric clinics, foster care agencies, school districts, churches, and local police departments across multiple states. She kept copies of the boys' birth information, old photographs, medical details, and every possible identifying feature from early childhood. The first major false hope came in the spring of 2007. A children's home in Atlanta contacted authorities after receiving a young boy who appeared to be around 4 years old. He had limited information about where he came from, and one staff member thought his face resembled the age-progressed material connected to the Sullivan case. The call reached Andrew and Rachel quickly. It was not presented as certainty, only possibility. But possibility was enough to reorder their entire world for a day. They traveled to Georgia believing they had to be careful, but unable to keep hope away. The boy's age seemed close. His background was unclear. The idea that one of their sons might have been abandoned, found, and placed into care had always been one of the scenarios they privately carried. It was painful, but it also meant survival. If one son had reached a children's home, perhaps the others had too. The DNA test ended that hope. The child in Atlanta was not Noah, Mason, or Caleb. The result was final, but the emotional damage was not. Andrew and Rachel returned to Charlotte with another name crossed off, another road closed, another reminder that the world was full of children in need, but none of them were their sons. They could not blame the children's home. They could not blame the person who had called. Everyone had acted out of concern. But concern did not make disappointment easier to survive. After Atlanta, similar calls continued over the years. A boy in Tennessee who resembled Mason. A child in foster care in Florida who had no clear birth history. A possible sighting at a small-town clinic in Kentucky. A boy in a church-run program who had once used the name Caleb. Each lead carried just enough detail to become painful. Each one forced Andrew and Rachel to imagine the same reunion again. One son found, one piece of the family restored, one answer after years of silence. Each one ended the same way. No match, no connection, no return. By 2010, people around the Sullivans began saying things they thought were compassionate. They told Andrew and Rachel that life could not remain frozen forever. They suggested grief counseling, moving to a new house, returning to work, starting a foundation, adopting a child, even having another baby if that was still possible. Some said these things gently. Some said them because they were uncomfortable with pain that had no deadline. No one meant harm, but most people did not understand that Andrew and Rachel were not refusing life. They were refusing to replace their sons. Rachel was especially firm. Noah, Mason, and Caleb were not memories to be packed away. They were her children. Until there was proof that they were gone forever, she would continue to believe they might be alive somewhere. That belief did not make her days easier. It simply gave her a reason to continue. Andrew carried the same belief, but his guilt took a different shape. He kept returning to the 10-minute gap on Myrtle Beach. In his mind, the whole case always narrowed to that one moment. The wind, the scattered belongings, the brief distraction, the empty space where the boys had been. He replayed it endlessly, not because it revealed anything new, but because punishment can become familiar when there is no answer. Rachel had her own version of the same guilt. She wondered whether she should have kept the boys closer, whether she should have ignored the things blowing away, whether some instinct should have warned her before the world changed. They did not openly accuse each other. That was part of what made the pain quieter and heavier. The blame turned inward. It lived beneath ordinary sentences. It sat between them during holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries. It followed them into every July. Then, in 2012, another call came, this one from Richmond, Virginia. A school administrator had become aware of a boy about 10 years old with a complicated background and limited memory of his early childhood. He had entered the child welfare system years earlier with incomplete records, and someone familiar with missing child cases noticed a resemblance to one of the Sullivan triplets. The age matched. The missing early memories matched. The uncertainty around his origin matched. For the first time in years, Rachel felt the old certainty rise again, the feeling that this could not be random. Andrew tried to remain cautious, but the details were difficult to ignore. By then, Noah, Mason, and Caleb would have been around 10 years old. A child found years earlier, without a reliable history, living under another name. It fit the kind of hidden path investigators had considered many times. Rachel let herself imagine that even if only one of the boys had been found, it would open the door to the others. They went to Virginia. The boy was kind, confused by the attention, and clearly carrying his own difficult history. Rachel wanted him to be one of her sons. For a brief period, everything in her seemed to organize itself around that possibility. But the DNA result came back negative. Again, the answer was no. That disappointment struck differently because of the boy's age. It forced Andrew and Rachel to confront how much time had passed. They were no longer searching for 3 toddlers. They were searching for children old enough to attend school, children who might have new names, new families, new memories, or no memories at all. Their sons could be growing up without knowing they were missing. After the Richmond lead failed, the Sullivans became quieter, but not less determined. Public attention had faded. The news rarely mentioned the case unless an anniversary approached. Some neighbors stopped asking because they did not know what to say. Friends drifted into their own lives. The world kept producing graduations, vacations, weddings, birthdays, and ordinary family photographs. Andrew and Rachel learned to live beside those things without fully joining them. In 2015, 10 years after the disappearance, the case was officially treated as a cold case. That classification did not mean it was closed, but it meant investigators had no active path forward. A detective told Rachel that new evidence would reopen the file at any time. She held onto that sentence with the seriousness of a promise. 10 years had passed since Myrtle Beach. The boys would have been 13. The photographs on the posters no longer matched the children they might have become. Their voices, interests, fears, and dreams were unknown to the parents who loved them most. But Rachel kept the files organized. Andrew kept answering calls. Every July 15th, they returned in memory to the same 10 minutes. By then, hope no longer felt bright, felt worn, stubborn, and necessary. It was not the easy hope of people waiting for good news. It was the difficult hope of parents who had been disappointed too many times to be innocent, but who still could not allow the world to erase the names Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan. By 2015, 10 years had passed since Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan disappeared from Myrtle Beach. The case was not closed, but it had reached the point every missing child family fears. It was officially treated as a cold case. For investigators, that meant there was no active lead strong enough to move forward. For Andrew and Rachel, it meant the world was asking them to live with silence as if silence were an answer. The detective assigned to review the file told Rachel that the case would never be forgotten. If new evidence appeared, if a witness came forward, if a child's identity was questioned, if any detail connected back to July 15, 2005, the file would be opened again. Rachel listened carefully because she needed those words to mean something. She had already learned that systems moved on more easily than parents did. A police department could change personnel. A news station could stop covering a story. A community could remember only on anniversaries. But a mother did not get to put her children into storage with old files. By then, the boys would have been 13 years old. That fact changed the way Rachel searched. She no longer studied only the faces of toddlers in shelters or child welfare notices. She had to imagine middle school boys, taller faces, changed voices, new names, different haircuts, unfamiliar lives. The photographs from 2005 were still the heart of the case, but they no longer matched the present. Age-progressed images became necessary, and Rachel learned to depend on them even though every version hurt in a different way. Each image was both hope and loss, an attempt to picture children she had not been allowed to watch grow up. Andrew remained involved, but the years had made him quieter. He still answered calls from investigators. He still traveled when a lead seemed serious. He still kept copies of case materials and contact numbers. But hope had become something both of them handled with caution. They had been wrong too many times. A resemblance could destroy a week. A phone call could reopen a wound. A DNA result could leave them back at the beginning, carrying another child's sad history without finding their own. In 2020, Noah, Mason, and Caleb would have turned 18. That milestone changed Rachel's grief again. They were no longer only missing children. They were legally adults somewhere if they were alive. They could be working, studying, driving, renting a room, applying for jobs, making friends, dating, voting, building lives under names she did not know. They might have no idea they were born in Charlotte. They might not remember Myrtle Beach. They might not know they had brothers. They might have been told a completely different story about who they were. That thought became impossible for Rachel to ignore. When the pandemic disrupted ordinary life in 2020 and 2021, Rachel found herself spending more time online. At first, it was practical. Many offices were harder to reach, in-person events were canceled, and missing child advocacy groups moved more of their work onto social platforms. Then she began to understand what the internet had become since 2005. In the year her sons disappeared, social media had not been part of the search in the way it was now. There had been flyers, local news, police bulletins, and database listings. By 2021, a single post could be shared across the country in hours. A video could reach strangers in states she had never visited. A face could be seen by thousands of people who had no connection to the original case. Rachel taught herself how to use Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok not as entertainment, but as tools. She created posts with the boys' names: Noah Sullivan, Mason Sullivan, Caleb Sullivan. She included the date, July 15, 2005. She included the location, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She posted the original childhood photographs beside age-progressed images. She wrote short captions explaining that the triplets had disappeared during a family vacation when they were 3 years old. She used hashtags connected to missing children, cold cases, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and triplets. At first, the response was small. Friends shared the posts. A few strangers left messages of support. Some people promised to keep an eye out. Others sent possible leads that did not hold up. Rachel learned to read each message carefully without surrendering herself to it too quickly. The internet brought reach, but it also brought confusion. People mistook resemblance for evidence. Some shared stories without checking facts. A few treated the case like a mystery to discuss rather than a family wound that was still open. Still, Rachel kept posting. Through 2022, she continued building the online presence around the case. She reposted the boys' images on their birthdays. She posted on the anniversary of their disappearance. She reminded people that if the boys were alive, they would now be young men. She asked anyone who had grown up in foster care, anyone with unclear adoption records, anyone who had unexplained gaps in early childhood memory, to consider the possibility that their identity might be incomplete. Nothing came. By early 2023, Rachel had grown used to disappointment in digital form as well. Her posts spread farther than flyers ever could, but distance did not automatically create answers. Then, on the evening of March 15, 2023, the first real break arrived in the most ordinary way. Rachel was scrolling through Instagram when a cooking video appeared on her feed. The account belonged to a young chef known online as Coastal Cal. He had become popular for combining Southern comfort food with modern recipes, especially seafood dishes and family-style meals inspired by the Carolina coast. His videos were warm, polished, and easy to watch, the kind of content people saved for dinner ideas or shared because it felt personal without being too heavy. Rachel was not focused on the food. The young man in the video was listed as 21 years old. His real name was not shown publicly. His profile said he lived in Charleston, South Carolina, had grown up in foster care, and had taught himself to cook before turning online videos into a career. Those details alone would have been enough to make Rachel pause. But what held her attention was his face. There was something about his smile that reached straight into the past. Not a general resemblance. Not the kind of similarity desperate parents could imagine if they wanted to believe badly enough. It was a specific familiarity. The way his expression changed when he smiled, the shape around his eyes, the warmth that reminded her of Caleb as a small child. Rachel had seen many boys and young men who looked somewhat like her sons over the years. This felt different. She found more of his videos. She watched older posts, short clips, recipe introductions, interviews, and casual updates. The more she saw, the harder it became to dismiss. Coastal Cal was 21. Caleb would be 21. Coastal Cal had no clear memory of his early life. Caleb had vanished at 3. Coastal Cal had grown up in foster care in South Carolina. Caleb had disappeared from a South Carolina beach. Rachel showed Andrew the account. He saw the resemblance too, but years of false leads had made caution almost automatic. He reminded Rachel that they needed facts, not only a face. Rachel understood. She did not want to mistake hope for proof again. But she also knew that some leads only became facts because someone had the courage to ask the first question. A few days later, Rachel found an older video that made the possibility even harder to ignore. Coastal Cal had filmed a cooking segment connected to Myrtle Beach. In that video, he mentioned that the place felt strangely familiar to him, even though he had no clear reason for feeling that way. He described the coast as something that seemed connected to a memory he could not reach. For Rachel, that was no longer something she could leave alone. She sent him a message carefully, without accusation and without claiming too much. She introduced herself as someone who had followed his cooking videos and said that the Myrtle Beach episode had moved her. She asked whether he had any personal connection to the area or whether he had ever learned anything about his earliest childhood. The reply did not come immediately, but when it did, it changed the direction of the next chapter of the Sullivan case. Coastal Cal wrote that he did not remember anything before around the age of 4. He said he had been raised through foster care, that his early records were incomplete, and that he had never known his biological parents. He had always been told he was found as a young child and later moved through the child welfare system in South Carolina. He did not know where he had been born. He did not know what name he had been given at birth. He did not know whether he had siblings. Rachel read the message as a mother who had spent 18 years waiting for one small opening in a locked door. It was not proof. It was not yet an answer. But for the first time in many years, the possibility in front of her was not built only on resemblance. It had an age. It had a missing past. It had South Carolina. And it had a young man whose face looked too much like Caleb Sullivan to ignore. Rachel did not send another message right away. After 18 years of false leads, she understood how dangerous hope could be when it arrived too quickly. Coastal Cal's age matched. His missing early memories matched. His connection to South Carolina matched. His face carried something Rachel could not explain away. But none of that was proof. A mother's instinct had carried her through nearly 2 decades of searching, yet she knew the world would not accept instinct as evidence. Neither could she ask a young man with an uncertain past to absorb the weight of her loss without care. For several days, she and Andrew reviewed everything they knew. They watched more of Coastal Cal's videos. They compared his features with old photographs of Caleb. They checked the timeline again and again. Caleb had disappeared at age 3 in July 2005. Coastal Cal said he had no memory before around age 4. He had grown up in the South Carolina foster care system. He was 21 in 2023. His public profile did not list biological family, hometown, or a confirmed birth history. The details did not prove he was Caleb, but they formed the strongest possibility the Sullivans had seen in years. Andrew remained careful. He had learned that resemblance could trick grieving parents. He had seen Rachel suffer after every wrong child, every failed DNA test, every call that led to someone else's story. But even Andrew could not deny that this lead was different. It was not only the face. It was the empty history behind the face. It was the way Coastal Cal had spoken about Myrtle Beach as if the place belonged to a memory he could not reach. It was the way the timeline held together without forcing it. Rachel finally wrote to him again. She did not claim to be his mother. She did not tell him what to believe. She explained that she had been searching for her missing son for 18 years, that her son Caleb had disappeared from Myrtle Beach in 2005 with his 2 brothers, and that Caleb would now be the same age as him. She told him that certain details in his story seemed important, especially the missing early memories and the time he had spent in foster care. She asked whether he would consider meeting, not because she wanted to pressure him, but because a DNA test could give both of them the truth. The message sat between them like something too large for ordinary words. Coastal Cal's legal name was Calvin Brooks. He had built his online identity around food because cooking was the first thing in life that had ever felt completely his. Growing up in foster care had taught him not to depend too heavily on any single version of home. Some placements had been decent. Some had been temporary. Some had treated him with kindness but never with permanence. By adulthood, he had learned to describe his past in short, clean sentences. Found young, incomplete records, foster care, self-taught cook, moved to Charleston, built a following online. That version was easier to carry than the full truth, because the full truth had always included a question no one could answer. Who had he been before Calvin Brooks? Rachel's message disturbed that question in a way he could not ignore. He knew about missing child stories. He knew people sometimes discovered late in life that they had been adopted, abandoned, or separated from their families. But being told that he might be one of 3 brothers taken from a beach in 2005 felt almost impossible. It sounded like something from a documentary, not something connected to his own life. Still, the names stayed with him: Noah, Mason, Caleb. Especially Caleb. He searched the case online. The articles were old, but they were real. The photos were real. The dates were real. 3 triplet boys from Charlotte had disappeared from Myrtle Beach on July 15, 2005. Their parents were Andrew and Rachel Sullivan. The youngest was named Caleb. The case had never been solved. Calvin looked at the childhood photos for a long time. He could not remember being the child in them. He could not remember Andrew or Rachel. He could not remember 2 brothers. But something about the images did not feel distant in the way old news usually did. The resemblance was there, and the lack of memory made it harder to dismiss. He agreed to meet. On April 10, 2023, Rachel and Andrew met Calvin in Charleston. The meeting was arranged carefully, without media, without public attention, and without anyone pretending certainty before science could speak. Rachel brought copies of the old photographs, the case information, and the age-progressed images that had been created over the years. Andrew brought the guarded restraint of a father who wanted to believe but feared what another mistake would do to everyone involved. For Calvin, the meeting was overwhelming from the beginning. He was used to people recognizing him from cooking videos, not from a childhood he could not remember. Rachel and Andrew did not treat him like a stranger, yet they also did not force familiarity onto him. That made the situation more difficult in a different way. Their hope was careful, but it was unmistakable. Their grief had lived with them for 18 years, and now part of it had taken the shape of a question sitting across from him. The photographs created no sudden memory. Calvin studied the faces of the 3 little boys, the family snapshots, the images from before the disappearance. He saw similarities, but not certainty. He did not feel the dramatic rush of recognition people imagine in stories. What he felt was confusion, pressure, and a strange sadness for people who had lost so much, whether or not he belonged to them. Rachel understood. She had not expected a forgotten life to return in one meeting. Caleb had been only 3 when he vanished. If he had been frightened, sick, moved from place to place, and then raised under another name, memory might not have survived in any clear form. The only fair answer would come from DNA. They agreed to testing. The days between the meeting and the result felt longer than the years before them in a different way. For 18 years, Rachel and Andrew had lived with uncertainty stretched across time. Now uncertainty had a deadline. A laboratory result would either close this lead forever or change the entire history of their family. Calvin tried to continue working, but the question followed him into every part of his life. If the test was negative, he would return to being Calvin Brooks, a young chef with missing beginnings and no clear biological story. If it was positive, then his life had been built on a name that came after the loss of another one. He would have parents. He would have brothers. He would have been a missing child without knowing it. On April 15, 2023, the DNA result came back. The match was undeniable. Calvin Brooks was Caleb Sullivan. The probability confirmed what Rachel had sensed from the first video. The young chef known online as Coastal Cal was the youngest of the Sullivan triplets who had vanished from Myrtle Beach 18 years earlier. The boy who had disappeared at age 3 had survived, grown up under another identity, and unknowingly returned to his mother through a cooking video on Instagram. The truth did not arrive as simple happiness. It arrived with shock, relief, grief, disbelief, and the immediate weight of everything still unanswered. Rachel and Andrew had found one son, but they had also learned that he had spent almost his entire life without knowing who he was. Caleb had found his parents, but he had also learned that his childhood had begun with a crime he could not remember. Andrew and Rachel brought Caleb back into the story of his own life as gently as they could. They showed him the family photographs from Charlotte, the pictures of the 3 boys together, the early birthday images, the records they had preserved, and the missing child posters that had carried his name for 18 years. Caleb did not remember most of it. At moments, certain names seemed to stir something faint, but nothing formed into a clear memory. The largest question remained. Where were Noah and Mason? Caleb had no memory of growing up with brothers. He had no memory of being taken from Myrtle Beach. His first real memories came from the child welfare system in South Carolina, sometime around the age of 4. He remembered being told that he had been found without reliable identification. He remembered moving through placements, learning to answer to Calvin Brooks, and gradually accepting that his early life was something no adult could explain. The confirmation of his identity forced police to reopen the Sullivan case with new urgency. This was no longer only a cold case built on missing children and unanswered theories. One of the missing boys had been found alive. That meant the original assumption had to change. The boys had not simply vanished into the ocean. Caleb had been taken from Myrtle Beach and later appeared in the South Carolina child welfare system under another identity. Investigators began searching for the first official record connected to Calvin Brooks. The file led back to Charleston in July 2005. A young boy, estimated to be around 3 or 4 years old, had been found severely ill and without identification. His early records were incomplete, and because his face and condition had made identification difficult, no one had connected him to the triplets missing from Myrtle Beach. At the time, investigators had believed that if the Sullivan boys were found, they would likely be together. The idea that one child could be abandoned separately while the others were taken elsewhere had not become the central theory. Now it was the only theory that made sense. Caleb's return gave Rachel and Andrew the miracle they had prayed for, but it also opened a deeper fear. If Caleb had been abandoned because he was sick, then Noah and Mason may have remained with whoever took them. They could have been sold, renamed, adopted illegally, or moved across state lines. They could still be alive without knowing their names. For the first time in 18 years, the Sullivan family had proof that one son survived. And that proof became the key to finding the other two. With Caleb's identity confirmed, the Sullivan case changed overnight. For 18 years, investigators had been working with absence. 3 missing boys, no confirmed route, no known suspect, no verified survival. Now there was one living son, one confirmed DNA match, and one hard fact that reshaped everything. Caleb Sullivan had not died at Myrtle Beach. He had been removed from that beach, separated from his brothers, and later entered the child welfare system in South Carolina under the name Calvin Brooks. That single truth forced investigators to rebuild the first week after the disappearance from the beginning. The renewed investigation focused on the narrow window between July 15th and July 19th, 2005. If Caleb had appeared in Charleston only days after vanishing from Myrtle Beach, then someone had moved him across South Carolina. That meant transportation records, emergency reports, child welfare intake forms, hospital logs, bus station notes, private security records, and old police files all mattered again. What had once looked like disconnected paperwork now had to be read as part of one hidden route. The FBI joined the case because the evidence suggested a possible child abduction that crossed county lines, possibly state lines, and may have involved an illegal adoption network. Local police in Myrtle Beach worked with agencies in Charleston, Charlotte, Raleigh, and other cities connected to old leads. The case was still difficult because 18 years had passed. Employees had retired. Records had been archived. Some businesses no longer existed. Cameras from that time were long gone. But Caleb's DNA gave the investigation something it had never had before: a biological anchor. Investigators returned to the earliest file connected to Calvin Brooks. In July 2005, a young boy estimated to be 3 or 4 years old had been found in Charleston without reliable identification. He had been severely ill, unable to provide a clear name, and too young to explain what had happened. His condition and incomplete information led authorities to treat him as an unidentified child in need of care. At the time, no one connected him to the missing Sullivan triplets because the public narrative centered on 3 boys disappearing together from Myrtle Beach. The idea that one could be abandoned separately while the other 2 were taken somewhere else had not been fully understood. Now that mistake became painful and important. The next step was finding how Caleb reached Charleston. Investigators reviewed old transportation data from the days immediately after the abduction. Most records were incomplete, but one entry stood out. On July 16, 2005, 2 adults and 3 young boys had purchased bus tickets from the Myrtle Beach area toward Charleston, using names that later appeared suspicious. The tickets had been paid in cash. The identification information was thin, and under the standards of that period, it had not triggered concern. The detail might have been ignored years earlier. Now it looked crucial. A retired employee connected to the bus station was located and interviewed. His memory was not perfect after so many years, but he remembered a group that had seemed unusual. 2 adults traveling with 3 small boys who looked strikingly alike. He remembered that the children had not seemed settled, and one of them appeared sick during the trip. At the time, he had no reason to connect the family to a major missing child case. Families traveled through Myrtle Beach every day in the summer. Children cried. Parents looked tired. Nothing about it had forced intervention. For Rachel and Andrew, that information was both confirmation and torment. Their sons had likely still been together the day after they disappeared. There had been a moment, somewhere between Myrtle Beach and Charleston, when all 3 boys were alive, near one another, and still close enough to the life that had been taken from them. But no one knew who they were. No one stopped the adults with them. No one understood that 3 missing children were passing through ordinary public systems under false control. Investigators believed Caleb became too sick for the abductors to manage. That explained why he was abandoned in Charleston and later entered the foster care system. But the question now became more urgent. What happened to Noah and Mason after Caleb was left behind? Caleb's DNA profile was entered into appropriate law enforcement and missing person comparison systems. Because he was confirmed as the biological son of Andrew and Rachel Sullivan, his DNA could be used to search for full siblings. Investigators also contacted adoption agencies, child welfare departments, private family law offices, and older foster care databases across the Carolinas and nearby states. They looked for boys around 3 years old who entered private adoption or informal guardianship arrangements in the summer or fall of 2005 with incomplete or questionable records. Within a week, a significant match came from Raleigh, North Carolina. A 21-year-old man named Ryan Mitchell had previously submitted DNA as part of a personal family history search. When compared through proper channels, his genetic profile showed a sibling-level connection to Caleb Sullivan. The match was strong enough to require immediate follow-up. Ryan Mitchell had grown up in Raleigh with Thomas and Karen Mitchell, a couple who had adopted him in 2005. They were respected in their community and had raised him with stability, education, and care. According to their account, they had wanted a child for years and were introduced to a private adoption arrangement through an intermediary. They had been told the boy was about 3 years old, had no available relatives, and had come from a difficult situation. The paperwork they received seemed sufficient to them at the time, though later review showed irregularities. Ryan's early memories were incomplete. He had grown up knowing he was adopted, but not knowing the full truth behind his adoption. As a child, he sometimes repeated names that sounded like Mason and Caleb. His parents had assumed those names belonged to imaginary friends, children from an earlier placement, or fragments of a difficult beginning. There had never been enough information to connect the names to a missing triplet case from Myrtle Beach. The DNA result changed that. Ryan Mitchell was Noah Sullivan. The discovery gave Andrew and Rachel their second son back, but it also deepened the horror of what had happened. Noah had been alive all along, living under another name only a few hours away from where he was born. Unlike Caleb, he had grown up in a stable home. Thomas and Karen Mitchell had not understood they were part of a crime. They had believed they were helping a child who needed a family. Their grief and shock became part of the widening damage caused by the people who had taken the boys. Noah's life in Raleigh had been full in ways his birth parents were grateful for, even through the pain. He had become a college student studying computer science. He was healthy, responsible, and loved by the family that raised him. But like Caleb, he had carried an unexplained emptiness. He had never been able to account for the names that appeared in his childhood, or the sense that his adoption story began too late, as if the first pages of his life had been removed. After Noah was identified, investigators turned to the adoption intermediary. The name listed in the Mitchell family's old paperwork did not lead to a legitimate agency. The address had expired years earlier. The phone number was disconnected. Several documents appeared to have been created to look official without passing through the proper legal channels. Whoever arranged Noah's placement had known how to exploit families desperate to adopt and systems that were not communicating well enough in 2005. The trail seemed thin until June 2023, when a new and unexpected clue emerged from Baltimore, Maryland. A middle school student had participated in a voluntary genetic screening program connected to a family medical initiative. The result showed a close biological relationship to the Sullivan family line, but the child was only 14 years old. He could not be Mason. He could not be one of the missing triplets. The age did not match, but the connection was real. Investigators examined the family link and found that the genetic relationship did not point to the boy as one of the missing children, pointed toward his father. For the first time, the investigation had moved beyond the lost children and toward a possible adult connected to the crime itself. The name attached to that family record was Gregory Walsh, a man whose past contained aliases, private adoption contacts, and connections to informal child placement arrangements across several states. By the end of that stage of the investigation, 2 Sullivan brothers had been found alive. Caleb had returned through a cooking video and a DNA test. Noah had been discovered through genetic comparison and an adoption record that had hidden the truth for 18 years. Only Mason remained missing, and now, for the first time, investigators had a name that might explain who had taken them. The discovery connected to Baltimore changed the investigation from a search for missing sons into a pursuit of the people who had taken them. Until that point, the case had been built around fragments: Caleb's incomplete foster care file, Noah's irregular adoption record, old transportation details, and the memory of 2 adults traveling with 3 similar-looking boys after the disappearance. Each piece suggested a crime, but the person behind it remained hidden behind false names and broken paperwork. Gregory Walsh became the first name that held under pressure. On paper, he appeared to be an ordinary man with a family in Maryland. But when investigators began tracing his past, the ordinary surface cracked quickly. Gregory had used multiple aliases. He had moved between several states along the East Coast. His name, or versions of names connected to him, appeared near private adoption arrangements that were never processed through licensed agencies. Some families remembered him as a helpful middleman who knew people in child welfare. Others remembered him as a man who could solve problems quietly for couples who wanted children but were afraid of long legal waiting lists. By June 2023, the FBI and local investigators had enough to bring him in. The evidence was not built on one document. It came from the accumulation of records that should never have connected: the 2005 bus route from Myrtle Beach, the false intermediary tied to Noah's adoption in Raleigh, the unexplained appearance of Caleb in Charleston, and the genetic link through Gregory's own family. It was no longer possible for investigators to treat him as a coincidence. Gregory denied everything at first. He claimed he had worked only as an informal referral contact, that families had come to him because the adoption system was slow and expensive, and that he had never abducted a child. He said old records were messy because people were careless in 2005. He said he did not know Andrew and Rachel Sullivan, had never been involved in the disappearance at Myrtle Beach, and had no connection to Noah, Mason, or Caleb. But the investigators had spent weeks rebuilding the hidden path of the 3 boys. They had the bus ticket pattern. They had the timing. They had Noah's adoption paperwork, which included a false contact tied to one of Gregory's aliases. They had testimony from a family that had once paid cash to a private intermediary. They had evidence that Gregory had worked with a woman named Marcia Reed, who had also appeared in questionable placement cases in the mid-2000s. The more he denied, the more each denial placed him closer to the center of the case. Marcia Reed became the second major figure in the investigation. She had once presented herself as a child placement helper, someone who knew desperate young mothers, overwhelmed relatives, and children who needed homes. In reality, she had helped move children outside legal channels. Some had come from vulnerable families. Some had come from unclear backgrounds. And in the worst cases, investigators believe children had been stolen outright, renamed, and sold into private arrangements disguised as adoption. Under questioning, Gregory's story began to collapse. He first admitted knowing Marcia. Then he admitted arranging private placements. Then he admitted that some paperwork had been falsified. Finally, when confronted with the Sullivan timeline and DNA evidence, he confessed to the crime that had haunted Andrew and Rachel for 18 years. On July 15, 2005, Gregory Walsh and Marcia Reed had been at Myrtle Beach. They had been watching families, looking for children who could be taken quickly and moved before an alert spread too far. The Sullivan triplets drew their attention because they were young, similar-looking, and memorable. Gregory later admitted that the very thing that made the boys precious to their parents made them valuable to people like him. 3 brothers could be separated and sold into different homes. Their matching age and appearance would make them desirable to certain illegal buyers, especially families who wanted young children and were willing to ignore questions. When the wind disrupted the Sullivan family's beach setup, Gregory and Marcia used the opening. The boys were only 3. They were trusting, confused, and easy to guide away from the place where they had been playing. Within minutes, the 3 brothers were removed from the beach and placed into a vehicle. The plan was to move them out of Myrtle Beach before police could organize roadblocks or alerts. The first destination was Charleston. From there, Gregory and Marcia intended to separate the boys and connect each child to a different illegal placement. But Caleb became dangerously sick during the trip. Gregory admitted the child's fever rose quickly, and he feared Caleb would die before they could complete the plan. A dead child would bring attention, police, hospitals, and a different level of criminal charge. So they abandoned Caleb in a place where someone would eventually find him. They did not do it out of mercy. They did it to protect themselves. That was how Caleb entered the South Carolina child welfare system as an unidentified boy. He became Calvin Brooks because no one knew he was Caleb Sullivan. Noah was moved next. Gregory arranged his placement with Thomas and Karen Mitchell in Raleigh through false documents and a private payment. The Mitchells had believed they were adopting a child whose background was tragic but legal. They had no idea the boy they renamed Ryan Mitchell was one of the missing Sullivan triplets. Gregory had relied on the emotional vulnerability of a couple who wanted a child and the gaps in oversight that allowed unofficial intermediaries to operate in the shadows. Mason's path was the last and hardest to uncover. Gregory admitted that Mason had been sent to Norfolk, Virginia, to a couple who had also paid through an illegal placement. The couple had taken him in under another name, believing or choosing to believe that the arrangement was acceptable. But in 2010, when Mason was about 8 years old, that couple died in a car accident. With no properly documented adoption history and no clear biological family on record, Mason was placed into Virginia's foster care system. From there, his life became unstable. He was moved through several homes and facilities. Some placements lasted months. Others ended quickly. Names changed on paperwork. School records shifted. Caseworkers changed. The child who had once been Mason Sullivan became Adrian Cole in the system. A boy with a partial history, a guarded file, and memories no adult knew how to interpret. By the time investigators found him in 2023, Adrian was living in Richmond. He was 21, working at an auto repair shop, and taking evening classes to build a trade career. Unlike Caleb and Noah, he had not grown up with a stable identity. His childhood had been interrupted again and again, first by abduction, then by illegal placement, then by the deaths of the people who had taken him in, then by years inside systems that never knew his real name. The DNA test confirmed what Gregory's confession had revealed. Adrian Cole was Mason Sullivan. Of the 3 brothers, Mason carried the most fragments from the day everything changed. He did not have a complete memory. He could not explain every hour after Myrtle Beach. But he remembered fear connected to travel. He remembered being separated from 2 boys who felt like part of himself. He remembered names that had stayed with him even when adults treated them as childhood confusion. Noah, Caleb. Sometimes he had said them in foster homes. Sometimes he had written them down without knowing why. No one had connected the names to a real case. When Andrew and Rachel learned Mason had been found, The relief was almost too large to hold. They had already recovered Caleb. They had found Noah. But Mason's story carried a different pain because his years had been the hardest. Caleb had grown up with uncertainty but eventually built a life through cooking. Noah had been raised by a loving family that had been deceived. Mason had moved through loss after loss, never knowing that 2 parents and 2 brothers had been searching for him the entire time. The investigation widened after Gregory's confession. Authorities began reviewing older private adoptions, missing child reports, and irregular foster care entries across multiple states. Gregory Walsh and Marcia Reed were not treated as isolated offenders. Evidence suggested they had been part of a broader illegal network that had exploited desperate adoptive families, weak documentation, and vulnerable children for years. But for the Sullivan family, the criminal case, though important, was no longer the only center of the story. For the first time since July 15, 2005, all 3 sons were alive and identified. Their names had been restored: Noah Sullivan, Mason Sullivan, and Caleb Sullivan. The unanswered question that had ruled 18 years of Andrew and Rachel's lives finally had an answer. Their boys had not vanished from the world. They had been stolen, renamed, separated, and hidden inside ordinary American systems that failed to recognize them. And now, after 18 years, the last brother had been found. On July 15, 2023, exactly 18 years after the day Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan vanished from Myrtle Beach, the Sullivan family returned to the place where their lives had been broken apart. This time, Andrew and Rachel were not returning with flyers, police contacts, age-progressed images, or another plea for the public to remember their sons. They returned with all 3 of their boys alive. They were not 3-year-old children anymore. They were 21-year-old men, each carrying a different name from the life that had been forced onto him, each carrying memories shaped by strangers, systems, missing records, and unanswered questions. Caleb had lived as Calvin Brooks, the young chef known online as Coastal Cal, building a life from food, discipline, and the quiet need to create something that felt like home. Noah had lived as Ryan Mitchell, raised in Raleigh by adoptive parents who loved him and never knew the truth behind the papers they had trusted. Mason had lived as Adrian Cole, moving through foster care after another loss, surviving instability with fewer protections than either of his brothers had received. For Andrew and Rachel, seeing the 3 of them together did not erase the 18 years that had been stolen. It did not return birthdays, school mornings, lost teeth, little league games, family dinners, graduations, or the private ordinary moments that parents build their lives around. It did not undo the years when Rachel studied the faces of strangers online, wondering whether one of them might be her son. It did not undo the years when Andrew followed dead-end leads across state lines, punishing himself for 10 minutes he could never change. But it gave them something they had feared they might never receive. It gave them the chance to know their children as adults. The reunion was not simple in the way people often imagine reunions to be. There was gratitude, but there was also shock. There was relief, but also grief. Caleb, Noah, and Mason had to learn how to be brothers again after growing up in separate lives. They had to learn the names their parents had given them and decide how those names fit beside the names they had carried for 18 years. Caleb was still Calvin to many people who loved him. Noah still had a bond with the Mitchell family, who had raised him with care. Mason still carried the records and scars of a system that had never known what had truly happened to him. Andrew and Rachel understood that finding their sons did not give them the right to demand that the past become simple. They could not ask Caleb to stop being the person he had become in Charleston. They could not ask Noah to turn away from Thomas and Karen Mitchell, who had been deceived but had given him a stable childhood. They could not ask Mason to heal faster than life had allowed him to be wounded. The only thing they could offer was the truth, a family that had never stopped searching, and a place where each son could belong without being forced to erase the life that came before. In the weeks after the reunion, the Sullivan home became a meeting point for people whose lives had been changed by the same crime in different ways. Thomas and Karen Mitchell had to face the devastating reality that their adoption had begun with another family's suffering. They cooperated fully with investigators and remained part of Noah's life, not as replacements for Andrew and Rachel, but as people who had loved him honestly within a lie they had not created. Caleb continued to work as a chef, but his online presence changed. His followers had known him as a warm, talented young cook. Now they learned that his life had also been a missing child case hidden in plain sight. Mason began receiving support that had never been available to him before. Family support, legal advocacy, counseling, and help rebuilding the documents of his identity. The criminal case moved forward with national attention. Gregory Walsh, Marcia Reed, and others tied to the illegal child placement network were charged for their roles in abduction, trafficking, fraud, and falsifying adoption-related records. Investigators uncovered evidence that the Sullivan brothers were not the only children affected. For years, people like Gregory and Marcia had taken advantage of desperate families, vulnerable children, weak documentation, and gaps between state agencies. They had hidden cruelty behind the language of adoption and opportunity. They had treated children as problems to be moved, names to be changed, and lives to be sold. The Sullivan case forced uncomfortable questions across the country. How many children had passed through private arrangements without proper oversight? How many families had trusted documents that were never legitimate? How many adults were living with missing pieces in their identities because no one had connected the right records at the right time? The answers did not come quickly, but the case made silence harder to defend. By 2024, the Sullivan family was still healing. Healing did not mean returning to the life they had before July 15, 2005. That life no longer existed. Healing meant creating something honest from what remained. It meant Andrew learning to speak to his sons as men while still grieving the boys he lost. It meant Rachel learning that motherhood could continue even after years of absence, not by pretending the absence had not happened, but by refusing to let it define the entire future. Caleb kept cooking. Some of his videos became quieter and more personal, focused on meals connected to home, memory, and second chances. He did not turn his pain into performance, but he allowed people to understand that food had been his way of building comfort when he did not know where he came from. Noah returned to school and became interested in technology that could help identify missing persons and reconnect families separated by broken records. He had lived for years with a loving family and an incomplete truth. Now he wanted systems to become better for the next child. Mason continued working toward independence, but this time he did not have to do it alone. He had brothers who understood parts of him no one else could. He had parents who had searched for him long before he knew he was lost. Rachel kept the social media account she had once used to find her sons. It no longer carried only desperate posts and old photographs. It became a place for other families to send stories, questions, and pleas for help. Rachel never promised miracles. She knew too well that not every missing person case ends with a reunion. But she also knew that a case can look impossible and still not be over. She knew a single video, a single DNA test, a single person willing to ask one more question could reopen a door that had seemed sealed for years. The names Noah, Mason, and Caleb Sullivan were finally restored, not as symbols in a cold case file, but as living people with futures still ahead of them. Their reunion did not make the crime less terrible. It did not make the years less painful. But it proved that even when the truth is buried under false names, broken systems, and time itself, it can still rise when someone refuses to stop searching. The Sullivan family's story became more than a story about loss. It became a reminder that love is not always loud, dramatic, or easy to recognize from the outside. Sometimes love is a mother learning new technology because the old ways failed. Sometimes it is a father answering one more call after 100 disappointments. Sometimes it is a young man agreeing to a DNA test even though the truth may change everything. Sometimes it is three brothers choosing to rebuild a bond that was stolen from them before they were old enough to understand it. There are wounds no reunion can fully close. There are years no court can return. But there is also a kind of hope that survives without guarantees. It does not depend on the world paying attention. It does not disappear when the news moves on. It waits, searches, learns, and tries again. And sometimes, after 18 years of silence, that hope becomes the road home. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your attention means more than you may realize, because stories like this are not only about loss, mystery, or reunion. They remind us of the quiet strength that lives inside ordinary people when life gives them a burden no family should ever have to carry. The Sullivan family's journey teaches us that love does not end when answers disappear. Hope may become tired, tested, and almost invisible, but it can still survive through years of silence. A mother's persistence, a father's refusal to give up, and the courage of 3 sons to face the truth show us that healing is possible, even after time has taken so much away. This story also reminds us to pay attention to the people around us. Somewhere, someone may be waiting for a message, a memory, a small clue, or a moment of kindness that can change everything. Sometimes, the truth is found not in one great miracle, but in the decision to keep searching one more day. If this story touched your heart, we would be truly grateful for your support. Please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful, emotional, and inspiring stories to more people. Thank you for being here, and may every story remind us that kindness, hope, and love still matter.